The autumn that came to Red Hollow in the year of Evelyn's 23rd birthday was the kind that lied to you. It looked beautiful. God, it looked beautiful. The cottonwoods along the creek turned the color of old gold, and the mountains to the west wore their first dusting of snow the way a gentleman wears a good hat, effortlessly, like they'd never known anything less. The air had that particular bite to it that made people in frontier towns feel briefly optimistic, like maybe the hard season coming wasn't going to be as hard as the last one, like maybe things were turning around. Evelyn Cross rode into that morning on a gray mare named Augusta, wearing a dark green riding coat her mother had brought from back east before the consumption took her, and she did not notice any of it. She had things on her mind. She had turned down Preston Mercer for the third time in 6 weeks, and she knew, the way women in small towns always know, with a cold certainty that lives somewhere behind the sternum, that this time there would be consequences. Preston was 26 and handsome in the way that men who have never been denied anything tend to be. Soft around the edges, with bright eyes that turned mean when he didn't get what he wanted. He was the only son of Clayton Mercer, who was the magistrate of Red Hollow, and more importantly, the man who held the paper on half the debts in town. Preston had made his interest in Evelyn known the previous spring, in the way that men like him make their interests known, through persistence that wore a smile on the outside and something else entirely underneath. She had refused him politely the first time, firmly the second. And the third time, at the Hargrove Harvest Dance in front of 30 witnesses, she had said something that made the women nearby cover their mouths and made Preston Mercer's face go the particular shade of red that Evelyn would later recognize as the color of a decision being made. She hadn't meant to be cruel. She had simply been honest. And honesty, she was learning, was its own kind of cruelty in a town where everyone already knew what they were supposed to pretend not to know. Augusta's hooves found the familiar rhythm of the main road as Evelyn guided her back toward the cross house on the north end of town. A 2-story wood and stone structure that her father, Edmund Cross, had spent 20 years building into something that looked like permanence. The bank her father ran occupied the ground floor of a separate building on the main street, and for Evelyn's entire life, the combination of the house and the bank had meant one simple thing. The Cross family did not have to be afraid of other people's power. That was before she understood debt. That was before she understood that appearances and reality could live side by side for years without ever actually meeting. Edmund Cross was at his desk when she came through the door, and the first thing Evelyn noticed was that he didn't look up. Her father always looked up. Edmund Cross was a man of deliberate courtesies. He stood when women entered a room. He looked people in the eyes when they spoke to him. He put down whatever he was holding when his daughter came home. These were not grand gestures. They were small ones. They were the kind that add up over years into something a person comes to rely on without realizing they've done so. He did not look up. "Papa?" "Sit down, Evelyn." She remained standing. "What's happened?" He set down his pen with the careful slowness of a man who has been rehearsing the next few minutes for some time and knows he hasn't rehearsed enough. He was 51 years old, her father. He had the kind of face that wore its age honestly, deep lines around the eyes, a jaw that had softened over the decades, hair that had gone from brown to iron gray in the years since her mother died. He was not a physically imposing man. He had never needed to be. His authority had always come from something quieter. Steadiness, judgment, the particular confidence of a man who knew his own value and did not feel the need to announce it. Looking at him now, Evelyn felt something cold move through her chest. He looked diminished. "Sit down," he said again, "please." She sat. What followed was 40 minutes that dismantled 12 years of assumption. Her father had, it turned out, been managing a slow catastrophe for the better part of a decade. It had started with a drought cycle that hit the ranchers who were his primary borrowers. When they couldn't pay, he extended their terms because he knew these men, had known their fathers, understood that a bad season was not the same thing as a bad character. He extended terms and absorbed the losses and told himself it was temporary. Then there was the fire at the Hargrove Mill. Then the bank in Durango that failed and took a portion of Edmund's liquidity with it. Then a loan he'd made to a man who turned out to have no intention of repayment and very good lawyers. Then another drought. Then another. He'd borrowed to cover the gaps. Quietly. From sources he thought he understood. Clayton Mercer had been one of those sources. "How much?" Evelyn asked when her father stopped talking. He told her. She sat with that number for a moment. It was not, on its face, an enormous sum. What made it monstrous was the interest structure, the compounding penalties, the clauses that had been written into the agreement in language her father had apparently not read with sufficient care, or perhaps had read and not fully understood, or perhaps had understood and been too desperate to refuse. The debt had grown in the dark the way certain things grow in the dark, quietly, consistently, without mercy. He owns the paper on the house, Edmund said, on the bank building, on most of the assets that would cover it. Clayton Mercer. Yes. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment. Outside, she could hear Augusta in the yard, the soft sound of the mare shifting her weight. And Preston. Her father looked at her then, and what she saw in his face was the thing she had been afraid of since she sat down. Shame. Not guilt exactly, something heavier than guilt. The shame of a man who had built a life on his children being able to trust him and had discovered, too late, that he'd undermined the foundation while they weren't looking. Clayton came to see me this morning, Edmund said, before you returned. What did he say? Her father was quiet. Papa, what did he say? He said that he is willing to restructure the debt, that he would consider the matter of the outstanding amounts, settled, under certain conditions. Evelyn's hands were very still in her lap. What conditions? Edmund Cross looked at his daughter the way a man looks at something he loves and is broken. He has a man in mind, someone he wants to see, established, given a proper situation, a woman of standing. A woman of standing, she repeated. It would resolve the debt entirely. The house would remain ours. The bank? Who? Her voice came out flat, almost unrecognizable to her own ears. His name is Caleb Boone. He works the Mercer land. Has for 4 years. Edmund paused. He's a good worker, by all accounts. A decent... He wants me to marry a ranch hand. It was not a question. She was simply saying the words out loud because they needed to exist in the air between them before she could begin to determine what to do with them. Evelyn, a ranch hand. She stood up. She was not aware of deciding to stand. Her body simply did it. The way bodies sometimes act ahead of the mind when the mind is occupied with trying to contain something too large for it. Because Preston couldn't have me, so his father is going to give me to someone else. Like a... She stopped, pressed her lips together, breathed. Like I am something that can be given. I know how it sounds. Do you? She looked at him. Do you know how it sounds, Papa? Because from where I'm standing, it sounds like you made decisions for years that you hid from me, and now those decisions have consequences, and the consequence is me. Edmund flinched. That's not... I'm not angry. She surprised herself by meaning it. She wasn't angry. She was something past anger, something colder and quieter and more dangerous than anger. I just want to understand what you're asking me. I'm not asking you anything, her father said, and his voice broke slightly on the last word. I'm telling you what was said to me, what you do with it. That is your choice. It has always been your choice. It hasn't, she said, but I appreciate you saying so. She left the room before she said something she couldn't take back. She spent 3 days thinking. She rode Augusta through the creek valley until the mare was tired and her own back ached from the saddle. She sat on the ridge above town in the evenings and looked at the lights come on one by one in the windows below, thinking about the people behind each pane of glass and the things they had agreed to in exchange for the lives they were living. She thought about her mother, who had come west from Philadelphia and never complained about the hardness of the life here, who had built something real and warm in a rough country and then died of a fever before she was 50 without anyone asking her permission. She thought about what freedom actually meant out here. She thought about who actually had it. On the 3rd day, she walked to Clayton Mercer's office on the main street, alone, without her father, without anyone, and sat across from the magistrate and told him she would agree to the arrangement. Her terms were simple. The debt cleared in full, the documents in her father's hands before any ceremony took place, and nothing asked of her beyond the legal fact of the marriage itself. Mercer was surprised. He had expected to negotiate longer. He had perhaps expected her not to come at all, to let her father bear the confrontation while she pretended it was out of her hands. He did not know Evelyn Cross as well as he thought he did. He agreed to her terms. They shook hands across the desk. His grip was dry and deliberate, the handshake of a man accustomed to sealing arrangements he considered favorable. His eyes, over the handshake, held something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite pity. It was, she thought, the look of someone who was enjoying a chess move. She walked home with the autumn wind cutting into her face and thought, fine, let him enjoy it. Chess could be played from either side of the board. She met Caleb Boone for the first time 4 days before the wedding. The meeting was arranged by Mercer, of course, who arranged everything, at the Cross House, in the front sitting room, on a Wednesday afternoon. Evelyn had spent the morning making herself presentable in a way that felt deliberately mechanical, like preparing armor rather than clothing. She chose her best wool dress, pinned her dark hair severely, and sat in the chair by the window with her hands folded and her expression arranged into something that was polite without being warm. She expected someone she could easily dismiss. She was not entirely prepared for Caleb Boone. He came in wearing clothes that were clean, but clearly his best. A dark shirt, trousers that fit him well enough, boots that had been resoled at least twice. He was taller than she expected, broad through the shoulders from years of actual labor, not the performed physical confidence of men like Preston Mercer, who lifted nothing heavier than their own opinions. He had dark hair, cut short, and slightly uneven in the way that men cut their own hair, and a face that was weathered in the particular way of people who spend their days outside. Lines at the corners of his eyes, a jaw that was angled and a bit rough. He was perhaps 28, maybe 30. He held his hat in both hands as he came into the room, and he looked at her with the directness of someone who was nervous but had decided not to show it through evasion. "Miss Cross," he said. "Mr. Boone." She indicated the chair across from her. "Please sit." He sat. He did not appear to know what to do with his hat, and after a moment placed it on his knee. There was a brief silence. "I want to say something before anything else," he said. His voice was low and even, not soft exactly, but careful. The voice of someone who had learned that words were not always free. "Go ahead." He paused, seemed to be choosing carefully. "This arrangement isn't something I sought. I want you to know that. I didn't ask for it. When Mercer came to me, I told him I thought it was wrong. He made it clear I didn't have a lot of room to—" Another pause. "I don't have a lot of position to refuse men like Mercer, but I want you to understand that I'm not someone who thinks this is how things ought to go. What's being done here?" Evelyn studied him. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know who you're dealing with." He met her eyes. "Even if knowing doesn't change anything." It was not the opening she had anticipated. She had prepared herself for awkward performance, the anxious attempt of a laborer trying to seem more than he was, or alternatively, the silent submission of a man who understood his place in the transaction and was content to occupy it. She had not prepared herself for straightforwardness. "It doesn't change anything," she said after a moment. "You're right about that." "I know." Another silence. This one felt different from the first, less like an absence of words and more like a space where words were being considered. "I have one condition of my own," Evelyn said, "beyond the legal arrangement." "What's that?" "I expect to be treated with courtesy." She said it plainly, without heat. "Not as property. Not as a debt repaid. I'm aware of what this is and what it isn't. I'm not asking for things that aren't realistic, but I am asking for basic respect. Can you agree to that?" Caleb Boone looked at her with something she couldn't immediately name. It wasn't pity, and it wasn't admiration, and it wasn't the uncomfortable surprise of a man confronted with a woman saying direct things. It was something quieter, something almost like recognition. "That's not a condition," he said. "That's just how people ought to be treated." She looked at him for a long moment. "Then we understand each other," she said. "Shab." The wedding was on a Thursday morning in late October. There were perhaps 20 people present, most of them there out of obligation to the Cross family name rather than genuine feeling about the occasion. Edmund Cross gave his daughter away with the careful composure of a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. Clayton Mercer stood in the back of the small assembly with his arms folded and an expression of proprietary satisfaction that Evelyn filed away in the part of her memory reserved for things she intended to address eventually. Preston Mercer was not there. She had half expected him to attend out of spite. His absence either meant he had more grace than she'd credited him with, or More likely, that watching the ceremony in person held less appeal than having arranged it. The minister was brief. The vows were standard. Evelyn said what was required in a clear, steady voice. When the ring, a simple silver band, was placed on her finger, she looked down at it for exactly as long as was necessary and then looked back up. There was no celebration afterward. There was a brief gathering at the Cross house, cold food and awkward conversation, and people who didn't know what to say and therefore said too much of the wrong things. Evelyn moved through it in the efficient manner of someone concluding business. By mid-afternoon, she and Caleb Boone were in his wagon, heading north out of town toward the homestead he'd built on a parcel of scrubland beneath the mountains. Everything she owned that mattered, 2 trunks, a writing case, the box of her mother's things she hadn't been able to leave behind, was loaded in the wagon bed. They did not speak much on the drive. The road roughened as they moved away from town, and the wagon jolted and swayed over the frozen ruts in a way that made sustained conversation difficult, even if either of them had felt like attempting it. The mountains grew larger as they traveled north, filling the horizon with their indifferent permanence. Evelyn watched them and thought about nothing in particular. Or rather, she thought about one thing, which she pressed firmly down beneath the surface of her attention, that she was 23 years old and the life she had expected to live, the life she had assumed in the vague way that privileged children assume their own futures, was simply the natural next thing, was gone. She had expected to choose her own husband. She had expected to continue running the household accounts that her father had always let her manage because she was better at them than he was. She had expected to be consulted, to matter in the visible ways that women of standing mattered in frontier towns. As organizers, as educators, as the social intelligence that kept communities from becoming purely transactional. What she had instead was a silver ring on her finger and a wagon taking her away from everything familiar into a November that had already turned cold. She did not let herself feel sorry about it. She had made a choice. The circumstances of the choice were unjust, but the choice itself was hers. She had sat across from Clayton Mercer and decided on terms. She had looked at this quiet man beside her and decided he was someone she could survive alongside. Survival, she reminded herself, was not nothing. The cabin was smaller than she'd allowed herself to imagine. It sat in a shallow depression at the base of the foothills, sheltered on 3 sides by a ridge of rock and scrub pine that would, Caleb told her, block the worst of the winter wind. There was a barn that was actually in better condition than the house, because that, she would learn, was the order of a working ranch hand's priorities. The house was one main room with a sleeping area curtained off in the back, a stone fireplace that dominated the far wall, a table, 2 chairs, a shelf with a modest collection of tools and provisions, and a window that looked west toward the mountains. It was clean. She gave him that. It was spare and rough, but it was clean. She stood in the middle of the room and took it in without expression, and he stood near the door and watched her do it, with the particular stillness of someone waiting for a verdict they're not sure they can effect. "The barn's solid," he said finally. "Augusta will be fine in there." "I can see that." She turned to face him. "We should talk about how this is going to work." "All right, I'll manage the household, food, supplies, what money there is." She had already thought this through. "I'll need to know what you have, what you earn, what debts you're carrying." He blinked. "I don't have debts." That surprised her. "None?" "No, I don't borrow." A pause. "I don't trust agreements I can't afford to get out of." Under different circumstances, she might have found that ironic, given that he was currently standing in a marriage arranged by someone else's debt. But she kept her face neutral. Good. Fewer complications. He told her what he had, the parcel of land, which was his outright after 4 years of payments, the small herd of cattle, 7 animals, that he ran independently from his work on Mercer's property, the cabin and barn, a modest sum saved in a tin box beneath a floorboard in the barn. He told her the amount without hesitation, which she noticed. She told him what she had, her mother's jewelry, which she would not sell unless it was absolutely necessary. The practical skills she had always considered less impressive than her father's profession, but which now seemed considerably more relevant. She could cook, preserve food, sew, manage accounts, doctor minor injuries, and teach, having spent 3 years helping the town school teacher before that woman left for a better position in Pueblo. They stood on either side of the table like two people at a negotiation, which was, she supposed, precisely what they were. "We can make this work," she said, "if we're practical about it." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "I think so too. I want to be clear about something." She met his eyes. "I'm not going to pretend this is something other than what it is. Not to you. Not to anyone who doesn't require the pretense for social reasons. We were both put in this situation by other people's decisions. I intend to make the best of it. That doesn't mean I'm going to be—" She searched for the word performative about it. Performative. "Pretending happiness I don't feel. Pretending this was my preference." He nodded slowly. "I can respect that." "Good." She turned to the first of her trunks and began to unpack. "Then let's get to work." November arrived fully the following week and announced itself by dropping the temperature 20 degrees in a single night and beginning a pattern of early mornings that turned a person's breath to vapor before they'd cleared the doorway. Evelyn rose early. She had always been an early riser, which was one of the few habits from her previous life that translated without modification, and began establishing the rhythms of running a household with materials considerably more limited than she was used to. She inventoried the provisions. She assessed the fireplace for heat efficiency and identified 2 gaps in the chimney stonework that were allowing heat to escape. She mentioned this to Caleb, and he repaired them that afternoon without comment. She organized the shelf. She developed a meal rotation based on what was available and what could be made to last. She was not comfortable. She was cold more often than not, and her hands, which had never done the kind of sustained manual work that frontier households required, cracked at the knuckles in the dry air and hurt in the evenings. The work was unrelenting in a way that the work of managing a banker's household was not. There was no staff here, no one to hand tasks to, no moments when she could simply stop because stopping was permitted. But she was occupied. An occupation, she found, was a useful thing. It didn't leave much room for self-pity. She noticed things about Caleb in those first weeks that she hadn't expected. He was not a man who explained himself unnecessarily. He did not fill silences with noise. He did not make claims about himself that he then needed to live up to. When he said he would do something, it was done. When he didn't know something, he said so, which, in Evelyn's experience with men in positions of any kind of authority, was unusual enough to be notable. He was also not what she had expected of a man with his limited formal education. He was not unintelligent. He was, in fact, quite perceptive. About weather, about animals, about people in the way that people who have spent their lives observing and not being observed often are. He read situations with an accuracy that she found herself respecting even when she didn't want to. What he couldn't do was read a page. Any page. She discovered this by accident, 2 weeks in, when she left a note on the table about needing lamp oil from town and found, on his return, that he had brought back the wrong supplies entirely. "Did you not read the note?" she asked. Something moved across his face. He started, then stopped. She understood then. She looked at him standing there in the doorway with an armful of things that weren't what she'd asked for, and she saw something that she recognized. Not shame exactly, but the careful management of a thing a person carries and has learned to work around. The slight angling away of the eyes. The particular stillness that was not confidence but the practiced simulation of it. "I can teach you," she said, before she had consciously decided to say it. "If you want." He looked at her. "To read and write." She kept her voice even. "If you want. It's not. I'm offering, not suggesting there's anything wrong with—" "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "Do you want to?" A long pause. The kind where a person is deciding whether to accept something offered at a cost they're trying to calculate. "Yes," he said. The lessons began that evening. Evelyn had no primers, no teaching materials beyond what she could construct herself. She had paper from her writing case, pencils, and 23 years of being someone who had always believed, perhaps with the particular arrogance of the educated, that literacy was simply a matter of being taught. She sat down to the task with the same efficiency she brought to everything and discovered, within the first hour, that teaching was entirely different from knowing. She had to think about why letters made the sounds they did, about why English spelling was, frankly, a kind of organized chaos that made no sense if you examined it too closely, about how to explain something she had internalized so young that she had no memory of learning it, only the finished product. Caleb sat across from her at the table with a patience that surprised her. He did not get frustrated when he made mistakes. Or rather, when he got frustrated, he did not direct it outward, but inward, quietly, pressing his lips together and looking at the paper with a concentration that she found, unexpectedly, almost moving. He was not embarrassed after the first night, when she'd kept her explanations matter-of-fact and her corrections gentle. He was simply determined. He practiced when she wasn't teaching. She would find him in the evenings, after supper, tracing letters on the back of whatever scrap paper he could find, feed receipts, the margins of her notes, once the back of a supply list she'd needed and had to piece together from his careful marks. "You don't have to practice that much," she told him one evening, amused despite herself. "You're not going to lose it overnight." "I know." He looked up from the paper. He seemed to consider how to say it. "I've wanted this for a long time. I don't want to be slow about getting it." She looked at him across the table, the lamplight making everything amber and warm, the fire doing its work in the hearth, the mountains outside invisible in the dark, and felt something she hadn't expected. She felt seen. Not by him exactly. Not yet. She felt seen by the situation, by the specific strange reality of sitting in this rough cabin on the frontier in a marriage she hadn't chosen, teaching a man who had also not chosen it, and finding in that the unexpected texture of something that might, eventually, be real. It was not comfort, it was not happiness, but it was not nothing. She turned back to her lesson plan and told herself to stop being sentimental. December brought the first heavy snow, and with it, the particular isolation of a frontier winter. The world contracted to the space between the cabin and the barn, to the daily work of keeping animals alive and fires burning and food on the table. The closest neighbor was 3 miles south. Red Hollow might as well have been on the other side of the world. Evelyn had not expected to be lonely because she had always thought of herself as someone self-sufficient enough not to require company. She discovered that self-sufficiency and loneliness were not, in fact, mutually exclusive. You could be entirely capable of managing your own affairs and still miss conversation, still miss the texture of a world beyond the same 4 walls. She found herself looking forward to the evenings. The lesson had expanded by December from simple literacy into something more complicated. Caleb was learning faster than she'd anticipated. His memory was extraordinary, actually, retaining patterns of letters and sounds with an efficiency that made her suspect he'd been compensating for his inability to read by developing other forms of recall to an unusual degree. He was reading simple sentences by the end of November. By early December, he was sounding his way through a page of prose, slowly but consistently, his finger moving under each word. "Stop moving your finger," she told him one evening. "You don't need it anymore. It helps me keep my place. Only until you stop needing it, which you won't, as long as you keep using it as a crutch." He looked up at her with an expression that was, she realized, quietly amused. "You always know when to push." "I was a student too, once." She paused. "My teacher used to take my ruler away from me when I measured things I already knew." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him actually laugh. A short, genuine sound. Nothing performed about it. Something in the room shifted slightly. Not dramatically, just shifted. "I'll try," he said, and put his finger in his lap. The conversations that grew up around the lessons were not things she had planned for. They talked about the things that came up naturally when 2 people are spending their evenings across a table from each other with nothing particular to hide behind. She told him about her mother, in a way she hadn't talked about her mother to anyone in years. Not the public version, the respectable dead banker's wife, but the private one, the woman who had laughed too loudly at her own jokes and had once, during a dust storm, taught Evelyn to play cards by lamplight because there was nothing else to do. He told her about coming west at 14 with 2 older brothers who'd eventually gone back east, leaving him here alone at 17 because he'd decided, with the absolute certainty of someone who has not yet encountered sufficient evidence that he might be wrong, that this was where he belonged. "Were you?" she asked one evening. "Right about it belonging to you?" He thought about it. "I think I was right that I belonged here. I'm not sure the here I had in mind is quite the same as the here I ended up in." She understood that in a way she hadn't expected to. "I had it the other way," she said. "I knew exactly where I belonged. I just didn't account for the possibility that where I belonged might not stay the same." He nodded. Not the polite nod of someone following along, but the considered nod of someone who has just filed something important away. These were not the conversations of two people falling toward each other. They were the conversations of two people learning, carefully and with some difficulty, that the other was more than the function they'd been assigned in an arrangement neither had chosen. They were slowly and without announcement becoming acquainted. January came with a cold so deep that it silenced the birds. There was a week, in the middle of the month, when the temperature dropped far enough to freeze the water in the barrel inside the cabin, and they kept the fire burning through the night and slept, both of them, near the hearth rather than in their respective sleeping arrangements, which had maintained, by mutual and unspoken agreement, a careful separation. The first night of that cold week, Evelyn woke at 2 a.m. to find the fire had burned low, and the cabin was cold enough to see her breath. She got up to add wood to the fire and found Caleb already there, on one knee in front of the hearth, building the fire back up with the deliberate economy of motion of someone who has done this specific thing many times in the cold. "I heard it drop," he said, without turning around, meaning the fire. So did I. She wrapped the blanket she'd brought from the sleeping area around her shoulders and sat in the chair closest to the hearth. He got the fire going again and then settled back against the wall nearby, not close enough to be intrusive, simply occupying the warmest part of the room. They sat like that for a while in the renewed warmth, not talking. "My brothers used to say I was too stubborn to freeze," he said finally. "What happened to them? Your brothers?" "Thomas went back to Ohio, married a schoolteacher, I think. Maybe a preacher's daughter. I haven't heard in 3 years." He paused. "Daniel got a position as a law clerk in Denver. He writes sometimes." "You have his letters?" It wasn't a question. She'd seen the small bundle of papers in the chest near his side of the sleeping area, seen them in the way that people who live in small spaces inevitably know what is in every corner of that space without intending to pry. "I have them," he said. "I've had them a long time, before—" A pause. "I couldn't read them. I asked the man at the general store in town to read them for me. Once." She was quiet for a moment. "Just once?" "Once was enough. Having someone else speak your brother's words at you—" He seemed to look for the right description and not quite find it. It wasn't his voice anymore. It was just words. Evelyn understood that better than she'd expected. "I'll read them to you," she said. "If you want, when you're ready." He looked at her in the firelight. "I'm almost ready to read them myself." "I know," she said. "That's why I said when." He looked back at the fire. After a moment, very quietly, he said, "Thank you." The winter held. February was harder than January, which was not how it usually went. There was a storm in the second week that kept them inside for 3 days, a howling thing that buried the barn halfway up the door and sent snow horizontally past the window for 36 hours straight. They worked the time the way practical people work confinement, by doing everything that had been postponed, repairing things, organizing things, and eventually, when everything was as repaired and organized as could be achieved in a cabin of that size, by simply sitting together in the warmth and talking. Evelyn found herself telling him things she hadn't planned to. About the morning she'd ridden to Clayton Mercer's office. About why she'd gone alone. About the specific quality of the handshake across that desk, which had felt, she tried to put it into words, like being confirmed in an inventory, like being accounted for. "I needed him to know I had walked in under my own power," she said. "That was the only part of it I could control. So I controlled it." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You walked into the wolf's den on your own. I was going to be inside it regardless. That's not wrong." Another pause. "You're not someone who waits to see what happens to you." She looked at him. "Is that an observation or a criticism?" "An observation." Something that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I mean it as, I think it's how you're built. The way some people walk into rooms looking for the nearest exit, and some people walk in already thinking about rearranging the furniture." She stared at him. "That is an extremely specific way to put it." "I've been paying attention." She looked at the fire. She was not sure she liked being paid attention to. She was not sure she disliked it. "What else have you noticed?" she asked, before she decided whether she wanted to know. He thought about it. "You're harder on yourself than you are on anyone else. You do it quietly, so it's hard to see. But you hold yourself to a standard you'd never apply to another person. The accuracy of this was uncomfortable. Most people are surprised I have any standards at all, she said, deflecting. Given the choices I've made. The choices you were left with, he corrected gently. She didn't answer. There's a difference, he said. I know there's a difference, she said, more sharply than she intended. He didn't push. He had a quality she was learning of knowing when to leave something in the room without requiring a response. It was a quality she had not previously associated with strength, but was beginning to revise her opinion on. The storm beat against the cabin walls. The fire burned. Outside, the world was entirely white and entirely impassable. Inside, something was changing, not dramatically, not with announcement, not with any of the markers she might have recognized from the stories she'd read as a girl about what it felt like when things changed. It was quieter than that, more like the way ice changes in late winter, not all at once, not with a dramatic crack, but gradually, imperceptibly, from something frozen into something that moves. She noticed it but did not name it. Naming things she had learned gave them a reality that could be taken from you. She preferred for now to let this particular thing remain unnamed. The storm ended on a Sunday. They dug the barn out together, working side by side in the blue-white aftermath, their breath-making clouds in the cold air, neither of them talking much because the work required the whole of their attention. When they finished, when the animals were checked and the path between cabin and barn was passable again, they stood for a moment in the bright, blinding snow and looked at the mountains. Spring eventually, Caleb said. Eventually, Evelyn agreed. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was just two people looking at the same horizon, standing close enough in the snow that the space between them had become, without ceremony or discussion, something measurably smaller than it had been in October. So, on the last day of February, she found the letter. It was on the table when she came in from the barn, folded carefully, with her name written on the outside in a hand she recognized as Caleb's, the careful, deliberate letters of someone who has learned to write recently and takes the formation of each one seriously. She stood in the doorway with the cold air still around her and looked at it for a moment. Then she came inside, sat down, and opened it. It was 3 pages. He had written it, she realized, over several days. The ink color changed slightly between sections, and the hand grew slightly more confident as the pages progressed, as though he had practiced the muscle memory of the letters enough that by the final page they came more easily. It was not, as she had half expected, a declaration of love. She would not have known what to do with a declaration of love. It was something else. She had to sit with it for some time before she found the word. It was a testimony, a careful, honest account of who he was and where he had come from and what he had thought and felt in the months since October. It contained no flourishes. It was not written in the style of someone performing vulnerability. It was written in the style of someone who had decided that honesty was the only thing he had to offer that was worth anything, and had therefore offered it completely. He had written, near the end of the 2nd page, I know that nothing about this situation was what you chose. I know what was taken from you. I don't think there is any fairness in it, and I will not pretend there is. What I can tell you is that I see who you are, not who this town decided you were, or who that arrangement made you into, but who you are when you think no one is watching. I see that person, and I think she is worth seeing. Evelyn sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Outside, February gave its last ground to the turning of the season. Inside, she sat in the quiet of the cabin and read the words of a man she had not chosen, and felt something she had been refusing to name for weeks begin to move through the silence like water under ice, steady, persistent, and entirely beyond her ability to stop. She folded the letter. She held it in her hands. She sat with what it had done to her. She did not cry, but she came closer to it than she had since the morning this all began. She didn't speak to him about the letter that evening. He came in from the barn at dusk, smelling of cold air and hay, and she was at the stove with her back to the door, and they moved around each other in the kitchen the way they had learned to move around each other over these months. With a careful awareness that was not quite ease but was no longer the stiff, provisional courtesy of October, she served the meal. He sat down. They ate. She could feel the letter's weight in her dress pocket, where she'd placed it after refolding it with hands that weren't entirely steady. He did not ask. She had learned by now that Caleb Boone did not ask for things he had already given freely. The letter was offered. What she did with it was hers. That was what the act of writing it had meant. Not a demand for response, not a bid for something in return. He had simply decided she deserved to know what he saw when he looked at her, and had said so. And now he was eating his supper without any of the anxious watching that another man might have done. That patience, she was finding, was harder to resist than any amount of pressing. The south fence line, she said, because she needed to say something, anything, that was about the practical world. The one near the creek. I noticed when I was out this morning that 2 of the posts have heaved with the freeze. They'll need resetting when the ground softens enough. I know, he said. I'll get to them in March. I thought maybe sooner. Ground's still too hard. You'd break the post trying to drive it. She nodded. She was not actually concerned about the fence posts. He looked at her across the table with those steady dark eyes, and then looked back at his plate, and she understood with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable that he knew exactly what she was doing, which was using the fence posts as a place to put her attention. That was not the letter folded in her pocket. She slept poorly that night. Not because of unhappiness, exactly. Because of the particular restlessness that comes when something inside you is reorganizing itself and hasn't finished yet, and the process is happening whether or not you've given it permission. She lay in the dark on her side of the sleeping area and listened to his breathing on the other side of the curtain. Slow, even, the breathing of someone who had worked hard and had nothing urgent unresolved, and thought about what he had written. I see that person, and I think she is worth seeing. She had spent most of her life being seen as something in the specific way that daughters of prominent men are seen as something. As the banker's girl, as the educated one, as Edmund Cross's asset, as Preston Mercer's rejected aspiration. She had been seen as difficult, as proud, as someone with opinions that were inconvenient. She had been seen as a debt, finally, and sent north in a wagon to settle accounts. What Caleb had written was not about any of those versions of her. It was about the version she kept mostly private, the one that cracked her knuckles in the cold and read by lamplight until her eyes hurt and felt, sometimes in the middle of a particularly hard day, a satisfaction in hard work that she would never have predicted for herself. That version, apparently, was visible to someone. She found that she did not know what to do with that. She fell asleep sometime before dawn, still not knowing. In the morning, she came out to find him already gone to the barn, the fire freshly built, and a pot of coffee on the stove. She poured herself a cup, stood at the window, and watched the mountains go pink with early light. Then she took the letter out of her pocket, sat at the table, and read it again. The second reading was different from the first time she had read it in the shock of unexpected honesty. The second time she read it with the particular attention of a woman deciding something, though she was not yet ready to define what that something was. She set the letter on the table when she finished. She sat with her coffee cooling in both hands. When Caleb came in an hour later, stamping snow from his boots, she said without preamble, "I read your letter." He paused in the act of hanging up his coat. "I figured. I wanted you to know She stopped, started again. "I'm not accustomed to being written to honestly." He turned. "Written to or spoken to?" "Either," she admitted. He came to the table and sat down across from her, and she noticed she was always noticing things she hadn't expected to notice about him. That he did not ask what she was going to say next. He simply sat and waited with the particular quality of his patience that she had stopped finding frustrating and started finding something else entirely, something she still didn't have a comfortable name for. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I see you too, whatever that's worth." He looked at her for a long moment. "It's worth a lot," he said quietly. "To me." She nodded. She looked at her coffee. She felt the thing in her chest that had been reorganizing itself settle into some new and unfamiliar configuration, not quite finished, but further along than it had been the night before. "All right then," she said, in a tone that meant the subject was not closed, but was being set aside in the way of two people who understand that some things need time and space to become what they are going to become. "The coffee's still hot if you want it." He almost smiled. "Thank you." It was not a romantic morning. The stove needed tending, and one of the cows had developed a concerning cough that he spent the better part of the day monitoring, and she managed to burn the bread at noon through inattention and had to salvage supper from what remained of the pantry provisions before the next town run. They did not speak again about the letter or about what she had said at the table, but the day had a different quality to it than the days before it, a slight shift in the pressure, the way barometric change can be felt in the body before a storm, except this was the opposite of a storm. This was something clearing. March arrived. With March came mud, which was its own kind of misery, the frozen ground releasing its grip in stages, turning the path between cabin and barn into a sucking mess that required a particular angled walk to navigate without losing a boot. The mountains still held their snow, but the creek at the base of the property was running again, and the sound of it reached the cabin in the mornings. There was a week in mid-March where it snowed again, briefly, a soft tentative snow that melted by afternoon, and then didn't come back. The lessons had changed by now. Caleb could read, not fluidly, not yet, but functionally, with the focused determination he brought to everything. He was writing full sentences, some of which surprised her. One evening she asked him to write about something he remembered, any memory, anything he chose, as an exercise in connecting the mechanics of writing to meaning. She expected something simple, a description of a place, a record of a task. He wrote, over the following 2 evenings, a paragraph about watching his father work a horse when Caleb was 7 years old. The paragraph was simple in its construction. He was still at the stage where simple sentences were more reliable than complex ones. But what it contained was not simple at all. He wrote about the way his father's hands moved without tension, about the horse's breathing settling, about the feeling of watching someone do something difficult and make it look inevitable. He wrote, at the end, I didn't know then that I was learning something. I thought I was just watching. Evelyn read it and sat with it for longer than a paragraph of that length required. This is good writing, she said finally. He looked up from where he'd been watching her read. The spelling is wrong in at least 4 places. The spelling is correctable. What's underneath it isn't something I could have taught you. She handed it back. You're a natural writer. You have something to say and you say it. A lot of educated people can't manage that. He took the paper back and looked at it with the careful disbelief of someone receiving a compliment they're not certain they can trust. She had noticed this about him, that he received praise with the same scrutiny he applied to other information, checking it for accuracy before deciding whether to keep it. You're not just saying that, he said. I don't just say things, she told him. You know that by now. He looked at her with something that shifted briefly across his face. Gratitude, she thought, but something underneath it too, something she was becoming increasingly aware of and increasingly unwilling to ignore. And then nodded. Okay, he said. Thank you. It was around this time that she noticed the town had opinions. She had expected this. She was not naive about how Red Hollow worked, had grown up inside its social machinery, understood its tendency to account for everything and approve of certain things and produce a low-grade persistent commentary on everything else. She had known, going into this, that the marriage would be a subject. What she hadn't fully calculated was how it would feel to be that subject when she rode Augusta into town for supply runs. The looks were not subtle. Some of the women who had been her acquaintances, not friends exactly, she recognized now, more like fellow participants in the social obligations of a town of that size, offered a particular brand of painful sympathy, the kind that wanted to help but also needed to confirm the narrative of her fall. Poor Evelyn Cross. The banker's proud daughter, reduced to this. She found it infuriating in a way she had not anticipated. Not because they were wrong about the reduction, the facts of her situation were what they were, but because of the way the sympathy contained within it an assumption that she was suffering in the way they imagined she was suffering, which was not quite the truth anymore, and the gap between their assumption and her reality was something she had no interest in explaining to people who had already decided what her story was. What made it worse was a conversation she had in early March at the general store with a woman named Martha Kelly, who had been friendly with her mother and who approached with the careful kindness of genuine concern. "How are you really, Evelyn?" Martha asked quietly, while the store clerk was occupied elsewhere. "I'm well, Mrs. Kelly. Thank you. You can be honest with me." A gentle hand on her arm. "It must be very difficult, living out there with—" She stopped herself. "He seems like a decent sort, but you deserve so much more than—" "Mrs. Kelly," Evelyn kept her voice even. I appreciate your concern, but I want you to know that I'm not suffering in the way you imagine. A pause. The life is hard. The circumstances were not what I chose, but the man I'm living it with is. She found herself searching for the right word, and the word that came was accurate and honest, and she made the choice to say it. He is a good man, a genuinely good man. I am aware that comes as a surprise to this town, but it's the truth. Martha Kelly looked at her with an expression that was equal parts surprised and unconvinced. I'm glad to hear it, she said, in the tone of someone filing information for later review. Evelyn paid for her supplies and rode back north, and she sat with the conversation for the length of the journey, turning it over. She had defended him, without planning to, without thinking through whether she should. She had simply opened her mouth and said what was true. She thought about that the whole ride home. When she arrived and he came out of the barn to help with Augusta, which he did without fail, without ever being asked, a fact that had ceased to surprise her weeks ago, she looked at him in the gray afternoon light and thought, he has no idea what I just said about him in town. He would not have asked her to. He would not have expected her to. She had done it because it was true, and because some part of her had decided, somewhere in the slow winter of becoming acquainted with this man, that his name deserved to be spoken clearly and without apology. The realization of that sat with her like something warm. She did not tell him about it. April came in like a deep breath. The thaw was real now, not the tentative softening of March, but a genuine warming, the kind that changed the quality of the light and brought the smell of wet earth and new growth through every gap in the cabin walls. Caleb spent long days out on the land, checking the fence lines, assessing the herd, preparing for the work of a ranch that had been largely suspended through the worst of the cold. She went with him sometimes, not to help with the physical work, which he was faster and more competent at than she was, but because she had discovered that she liked the land. This also surprised her. She had grown up in town, with the cultivated relationship to nature that town dwellers have, appreciating the view, managing the weather, otherwise maintaining a practical distance. But out here, where the land was not backdrop but actual ground under actual feet, where the life of the property depended on understanding what the sky was doing and what the soil could hold and when the water would run, she found she was interested. She asked questions. He answered them without condescension, which continued to be notable. Most men she'd known answered women's practical questions with the particular weariness of people performing a burden. Caleb answered as though the questions were interesting, because apparently, to him, they were. He had a rancher's love of the land that was specific rather than sentimental. Not isn't this beautiful, but look how this drainage affects the south pasture, and these grasses tell you what the soil can hold, and watch how the cattle move when they know the weather is shifting. She found herself learning things she had never expected to learn. She found also that she did not mind learning from him. You could run this whole property, he said one afternoon in early April. They were on the East Ridge looking down at the homestead, the cabin, the barn, the small herd moving slowly in the south pasture. If you had to, she looked at the property. I wouldn't know how to manage a herd. You'd figure it out. You figure everything out. He said it as a simple fact, the way he said most things. You've been paying attention to everything since October. All of it is in there. He tapped his temple. You're the kind of person who can't be somewhere without learning it. She was quiet for a moment. You say that like it's a virtue, isn't it? In this town, it's a defect. Women who notice everything and remember it make people nervous. This town's nervous about a lot of things it shouldn't be. He looked at the property below. You could teach here, you know. This valley, there are families another 10, 12 miles out who don't get their children into Red Hollow for school. Not in winter, not with the distance. Some of those kids can't read. She turned to look at him. You've thought about this. I've thought about a lot of things. I had 28 years of not being able to talk to many people about what I was thinking. He almost smiled. You created an outlet. She laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to. A short, real sound, nothing careful about it. He looked at her when it happened, and the expression on his face was something she had seen building for weeks and had been carefully not acknowledging because acknowledging it would have required doing something about it, and she had not yet been ready to do something about it. She was, she thought, looking down at the homestead in the April light, with the creek running silver below, getting closer to ready. Tell me about the families, she said. The ones in the valley, he told her. They stood on the ridge for another hour, talking about children who were growing up without letters and numbers, about what that cost them in the world they were going to have to navigate. Caleb spoke about it with the particular feeling of someone for whom the subject is personal, which it was, she knew now, thoroughly. He had lived those costs. He had navigated that world for 28 years with a lack he carried quietly and worked around constantly. And the intelligence he'd used to manage that lack was the same intelligence that was now filling in the gap with a speed and thoroughness that still sometimes took her breath away. They did not come down from the ridge until the light started to go, walking back to the cabin in the dusk, close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched on the narrow path. Evelyn felt the particular quality of a thing that has changed without announcement. Not their relationship, exactly. That was still what it was, still in the process of becoming something that neither of them had named. But something in her. Something about the tally she'd been keeping, maybe unconsciously, since October. The ledger of what she'd lost and what she'd gained and whether the columns would ever balance. She thought they might. She did not say so, but she thought it. May came, and with it the first real test of who they were together when other people were involved. A man named Grover Hatch rode up to the property on a Tuesday with a complaint. He was a neighboring rancher, the property to the east, close to 4 miles away, and he had been running cattle on the creek pasture that bordered Caleb's land with what Caleb had previously tolerated as informal arrangement during the winters when no one was using it. Now that spring was here and Caleb's herd needed the creek pasture, Hatch was not inclined to move his animals, and had arrived to say so with the particular confidence of a man who had previously dealt only with a quiet laborer and was not prepared for what he now found. Evelyn was in the yard when Hatch arrived. She saw his face register surprise when he realized she was not going to go inside and defer to Caleb. "Mr. Hatch," she said, what brings you out?" He was a big man, weathered and blunt, with the slightly dismissive quality of someone who filed things in simple categories. "I'm here to see Boone about the creek pasture." "I'm aware of the creek pasture situation," she said. "Caleb told me about it last week." Hatch blinked. He had the adjusting expression of a man recalibrating quickly. "Well, I suppose I can tell you the same as I'd tell him. Those are my cattle down there. They've been grazing that land all winter. I don't see why—" "They've been grazing land that belongs to this property," Evelyn said. Her tone was even, not unkind. "Winter use by informal courtesy, which Caleb extended because it cost us nothing in winter. It costs something now, so we'll need the pasture back." Hatch looked at her with the careful look of a man deciding whether he's being challenged by someone he's required to take seriously. "Is Boone going to come tell me that himself, or—" "I just told you," she said. "That's the same as him telling you." Caleb came out of the barn at that point, having heard the horse arrive. He took in the scene with a quick read. Her standing in the yard, Hatch on his horse. The particular set of Evelyn's shoulders that he had learned meant she was entirely in control of the situation and did not require assistance but might accept it. "Hatch," he said. "Boone." The rancher shifted on his horse. She says you need the creek pasture." "We do. You'll need to move the animals by end of week." Hatch looked between them. Something about the united front. The two of them standing in the yard, speaking with one voice, the absence of any gap between them that he might have worked into, seemed to settle it for him. He grumbled. He said something about neighborly arrangements and short notice. But he said he'd move the cattle. When he had gone, Caleb looked at Evelyn. "You handled that before I got there." "You were in the barn." "I know. I'm saying you handled it." She dusted her hands on her skirt, not because they were dirty, but because she needed something to do with them. "He would have pushed harder with just you. Men like Hatch read softness into courtesy. I wanted him to see from the start that there wasn't any." "There isn't," Caleb said. He said it with a quiet certainty that had nothing defensive in it. She looked at him. The May afternoon was warm and bright, and the creek pasture was green below them, and the mountains had lost most of their snow. And standing here in the spring with this man she had not chosen and had come to know. With a thoroughness that surprised her, Evelyn Cross felt something she had not felt since before October. She felt like herself, fully, without apology, without performance. Not the banker's daughter, not the discarded pride of a small town, not a debt or an arrangement or a scandal. Herself. The version she'd written about in her own journals since she was 15, the one who said what she thought and managed what needed managing and refused to be diminished, but who also, when she found someone worth caring about, cared without calculation. She hadn't known, in October, whether she would find that version of herself still alive out here. She was finding she had not only found her, but had somehow, in the cold and the work and the long evenings by the fire, let her grow into something stronger than she'd been before. Caleb was watching her with that particular attention of his. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "Just, spring looks good on you." She looked at him, her mouth curved before she decided on it. "That is the most you have ever said that could be called flattery." "I know. I'm building up to it slowly." She laughed again, that same unguarded sound, and turned back toward the cabin, and he fell into step beside her on the path, close enough that their hands nearly touched, and neither of them moved to create distance. They had supper that evening with the door open to the warm air, something they had not been able to do in months, and the sounds of the property in late afternoon, cattle settling, the creek running, birds returning from wherever birds went in winter, came into the cabin and filled the spaces between their words. He told her that evening about learning to read Daniel's letters. He had done it 2 weeks prior, while she was in town, alone in the cabin with the small bundle of paper he'd kept for years, unread. He had sat at the table in the afternoon light and worked through them slowly, one by one, in the careful way he read now, not rushing, letting the words resolve themselves, going back when something didn't come clear the first time. "How were they?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. He's doing well. He's made something of himself. He's proud. You can hear it in the writing. He doesn't say it outright, but it's there." A pause. "He asked after me, asked if I'd found my footing." Caleb looked at the open door, at the evening coming down over the mountains. 3 years ago, when he wrote that, I didn't have an answer I wanted to write back. And now?" He looked at her across the table. Not the full force thing, not yet, but close enough that she felt it in her sternum. "Now I think I'd write back." She held his eyes for a moment. "You should," she said. "He'd be glad to hear from you." "I know." He nodded slowly. "I'll write to him this week." He did. She watched him write it over 2 evenings. The careful, deliberate construction of a man who was still learning the architecture of letters, but who had, as she'd told him months ago, something real to say. He showed her when he finished. The letter was 2 pages. It was honest about the years of silence, direct about why without being theatrical. It told his brother about the homestead, the herd, the property. It mentioned, in the last paragraph, with the particular restraint of someone not sure how much to say, that he had married and that she was a woman worth knowing. Evelyn read that last line twice. She handed the letter back without commenting on it. But in the evening, after they had cleaned up from supper, and the lamp was burning low and he was reading at the table, he read every evening now, anything she could find for him. The almanac, the newspaper that came up from town occasionally, the 3 books she had brought in her trunk. She looked at him across the room and felt the thing she'd been refusing to name complete its reorganization and settle, quietly and without ceremony, into a shape she finally recognized. She was in love with him, not the way she had imagined loving someone, back when she'd imagined it as a young girl in her father's comfortable house, not the performed romance of social courtship, not the careful presentation of compatible families. This was something rawer and more inconvenient and considerably more real. It had grown in the dark and the cold, out of necessity and honesty and the specific intimacy of 2 people who have shared a hard winter and come through it knowing each other's rough edges and having decided, without discussion, that those rough edges were acceptable. She did not say anything about it that evening. She was not ready to. The knowing and the saying were 2 different things, and she had learned, had always known, really, that she did not speak until she was certain, and she needed a little more time to be certain that what she was feeling was what she thought it was, and not simply the gratitude or the relief of having survived something. But she thought, sitting across the room from him in the lamplight while he read, and the May night came down soft and warm over the mountains, that she was getting close. She was getting very close. Outside, the creek ran in the dark, moving over the same stones it had moved over all winter, patient and continuous and indifferent to the season, carrying whatever the mountains gave it toward whatever waited below. Inside, the lamp burned. He turned a page. She watched him do it and said nothing. And the quiet between them was not the quiet of two people with nothing to say, but the quiet of two people who have said, across many evenings, enough that the silence is now a kind of language they share. That silence, she thought, was its own kind of truth. The thing about arriving at a feeling you've been avoiding is that once you've named it, you can't put it back. Evelyn knew this about herself. She had always been someone who, once she understood something clearly, could not pretend otherwise. It was the same quality that had made her refuse Preston Mercer 3 times, when one refusal with better political timing might have saved her family's situation. It was the same quality that had made her walk alone into Clayton Mercer's office, rather than let her father bear the negotiation. She did not have the particular talent of convenient blindness that made certain people's lives considerably easier. So she carried the knowing through the rest of May and into June, quietly, the way you carry something fragile in a coat pocket, aware of it constantly, careful not to jostle it, waiting for the right moment to take it out. June, in the valley, was a different world from the winter they'd survived. The property opened up in ways the cold months had concealed. The south pasture greened deeply, the creek ran clear and fast with snowmelt, and the mountains that had been a white wall against the sky softened into something layered and dimensional, the tree lines distinct, the ridge lines accessible. Caleb expanded the herd by 2 animals, a calculated risk, he said, that the summer grass would support, and spent his long days in the work of a property that was, she could see clearly now, actually thriving under his management. He was not a man who talked about what he was building. He simply built it, day by day, with a consistency that was not glamorous, but was the kind of thing that, over time, became something real. She had stopped measuring him against what she'd expected in October so long ago that she sometimes forgot she'd ever done it. What had finally forced the issue, the naming, the decision that the waiting was finished, was not a dramatic moment. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in the second week of June when she came around the side of the barn and found him teaching one of Grover Hatch's ranch hands to read. The man, young, maybe 19, with the sunburned neck and nervous hands of someone unused to sitting still, was hunched over a piece of paper at the fence post while Caleb stood beside him pointing at letters with a patience that Evelyn recognized from her own side of that table the previous winter. She stopped where she was, just at the barn's corner, and watched without announcing herself. "Sound it out," Caleb was saying. "Each piece separate. Don't try to get the whole word at once." "Mr. Bertsois, bro." The young man's mouth worked. "Brother? That's it. There it is." The young man, his name was Tommy, she learned later, the youngest of 3 sons of a rancher who'd never seen the point in schooling his boys, looked up from the paper with an expression Evelyn recognized. It was the particular expression of someone who has just discovered that a door they believed was locked has always been open. Pure, uncomplicated surprise. "That says brother," Tommy said, stating a fact so he could hear it out loud. Every time, Caleb said, she went back around the barn without letting them see her. She stood on the other side of it with her hand on the rough wood and felt something move through her chest that had no particular name, not quite tenderness, and not quite grief, and not quite joy, but an alloy of all 3, the way complex things are usually alloys. He hadn't told her he'd started teaching Tommy Hatch. He hadn't made anything of it. He had simply, at some point, done it, the way he did most things that mattered, without announcement, without waiting for permission or credit. She thought about what he had written in February. "I see who you are when you think no one is watching." She thought about the fact that she had just seen who he was when he thought no one was watching. She went inside and started supper, and by the time he came in, Tommy having ridden back to Hatch's property, she had made a decision. She waited until after supper, when the dishes were done and the lamp was burning, and he had settled at the table with the newspaper from town. He read the newspaper now front to back, sometimes arguing quietly with the editorial positions, in a way that made her smile even when she was trying not to. She sat across from him. He glanced up. "I saw you with Tommy Hatch today," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he put the paper down. "I was going to mention it." "How long has that been going on?" 3 weeks. He looked at her with the expression she recognized as his version of accountability. No deflection, no performance of casualness. "He asked me." He saw me reading the almanac one afternoon and asked if I'd learned recently. I told him about the situation. A pause. He wanted to learn too. I didn't think you'd object, but I should have told you. I don't object, she said. That's not why I'm bringing it up. He waited. She set her hands flat on the table. This was not how she had imagined saying this. There had been some version in her head that was more composed, more deliberate. But composure, she was learning, was often the enemy of honesty. I want to say something, and I want you to let me finish it before you respond, she said. All right. When I married you, I had decided to survive it. That was my entire goal. Survive the situation, maintain my dignity, keep my father from ruin, and manage whatever came after with as much practical intelligence as I could bring to it. She kept her eyes on his. I did not expect to be moved by you. I didn't expect to find someone in this. I thought I knew what was possible inside an arrangement like ours, and I had made my peace with the limits of it. The room was very quiet. I was wrong about the limits, she said. I've been wrong about them for some time. I've known it since February, and I've been waiting to be more certain, and I am certain, Caleb. I'm in love with you. She said it plainly, the way she said things she meant. Not because you've been kind to me, though you have been. Not from gratitude. Because I know who you are. I've seen you in the cold and in the hard months and in the moments you thought no one was watching, and I know who you are, and I love that person. I wanted you to know. He looked at her for a long moment. She saw something cross his face that she couldn't fully read. Something complicated. Some emotion that had more than one layer to it. And for one terrible second she thought she had miscalculated, had moved too far too fast, had said too much of what was true. Then he said, very quietly, I've been afraid to say it first. She blinked. What? I've been in love with you since January. He said it with the slight roughness of someone delivering something they've held a long time. Since the night the fire went low and you sat up with me and talked about your mother. I didn't think it was fair to put that on you. You didn't come here for this. I thought if I said it, you'd feel... He stopped. Obligated. Or like the situation was pressing you into something. She stared at him. You've been in love with me since January, and you wrote me that letter in February, and you didn't say it. The letter said most of it. It said everything except the main thing. I know. He looked at the table. I didn't think I had the right. She felt something between exasperation and tenderness so acute it was almost painful. Caleb, you are my husband. A husband you didn't choose. I choose now, she said. That's what I'm telling you. Whatever I didn't choose in October. I'm choosing this now. You, this. She gestured at the table, at the cabin, at the mountains outside the window. All of it. He looked at her with something that was not composure. Something that was the opposite of composure. Something that showed clearly on his face and that she realized she was glad to see because it meant the feeling was real enough to break through the careful management he applied to everything else about himself. You're sure, he said. I don't say things I'm not sure of. You know that. I know. He let out a slow breath. I know you don't. He reached across the table. Not dramatically, just reached across and put his hand over hers, on the table between them, in the lamplight. She looked at his hand on hers, at the calluses, the rough knuckles, the visible evidence of every year of labor that this town had used to define him as lesser. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat like that for a long time without talking. It was not a perfect moment. There was no perfection in it. The lamp smelled slightly of bad oil, and she had burned the biscuits at supper, and there was a crack developing in the east wall of the cabin that they were going to have to address before autumn. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn, and the creek ran in the dark. It was, for all of that, the truest thing she had felt in a very long time. The weeks that followed were not a transformation. They were the same life, the same hard work, the same rough frontier property under the same demanding sky. But they were different in the way that a familiar landscape is different when you stop moving through it with one eye on the exit. They were the same place, seen from the inside rather than the outside, seen as a place you had chosen rather than a place you'd been assigned. She noticed small things differently. The way he handed her the first coffee of the morning without asking how she took it anymore because he'd known for months. The way she had stopped waiting to see what he would decide and simply told him what she thought, because she had learned that he wanted to know. The way they had developed, without planning it, a system of navigating the same small spaces without getting in each other's way, a choreography of small courtesies that only happens between people who have paid close attention to each other for a long time. There was nothing effortless about it. They argued sometimes, not viciously, but genuinely, in the way of two people with strong opinions who live in a small space. She thought he was too slow to ask for help when the property needed more labor than one man could provide. He thought she pushed herself past the point of practical exhaustion because she didn't know how to stop. These were not small disagreements. They were disagreements about fundamental qualities in each other, things that weren't going to change. They had one particular argument in late June over money that lasted 2 days and left them both somewhat worn out, and caused Evelyn to ride Augusta too hard through the Creek Valley until the mare was tired and she'd calmed down sufficiently to see that she was half wrong about the specific thing and entirely right about the underlying thing, which was a distinction she had to think through carefully before she could explain it to him. She came back in the evening and said, "I was wrong about the numbers, but right about the principle." He was splitting wood in the yard and paused. "I know. I've been wrong about the numbers too by about $10. I found the error this afternoon." She got off Augusta. "So we're both partially wrong." "Seems like." He set down the axe. "You want to start over on it?" "Yes." They went inside and spread the accounts across the table and worked through them together, and by the end of the evening they had arrived at a solution that was neither of their original positions but was better than both, and Evelyn felt the particular satisfaction of being in a partnership that was actually a partnership, two intelligences working a problem together rather than two people performing the roles they'd been assigned. That was the thing she had not anticipated about loving him. Not the tenderness of it, though there was tenderness. It was the specific satisfaction of being in a real partnership with someone who respected what she could do. She had not known she was waiting for that until she had it. July arrived, and with it the particular heat of high summer on the frontier, not the oppressive wet heat of lower elevations, but a dry, burning kind that made the air shimmer over the south pasture in the afternoons and drove the cattle to the creek shade and made the evenings, when the temperature finally dropped, feel like mercy. Tommy Hatch had progressed quickly. He was coming to the property 3 times a week now, and Caleb had him reading simple passages and working on his letters in the evenings when the day's work allowed. The boy had the same quality Caleb had had, raw intelligence that had simply never been given a channel, and watching Caleb teach him with the patience and lack of condescension that Evelyn had experienced from the other side of that table, she felt something solidify in the thought that had been forming since April, since the day on the East Ridge when he talked about the children in the valley who couldn't read. She brought it up one evening when Tommy had gone and they were sitting on the cabin's small front step in the cooling air. "I want to open a school," she said. He looked at her. "A proper one. Not just Tommy, not just whoever happens to ask. A school for the children in this valley who can't get into Red Hollow. There are families 8, 10, 12 miles out. Children who are growing up without letters." She had been thinking about the logistics for weeks, and it showed. She had it organized in her head, the practical requirements, the problems, the solutions she'd identified. "I would need a space. Not the cabin, somewhere larger. I'd need materials. Paper. Slates if I can get them. Primers." She paused. "And I would need your help building the space." He was quiet for a moment. "Where would you build it?" "The old structure at the north edge of the property. The one you were using for equipment storage. It's sound. The walls are good. It would need the interior cleared, a few improvements, proper light from windows on the south wall." "I can do that," he said. "It would take a couple weeks." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me it's impractical?" "It's not impractical. It's a lot of work, but it's not impractical." He looked out at the property. "I've been thinking about it too, since we talked on the ridge." A pause. "I just didn't know how to bring it up without it sounding like—" He seemed to look for the word. "Like you were assigning me a role." "Yes." She considered. "That's a thoughtful distinction. I've had some time to think about how things sound." She smiled, looking at the darkening mountains. "We're going to need support. People in town will resist it, some of them. They'll say it's outside the proper order of things. Some of them have been saying that about us since October. And He looked at her with that level steadiness she had come to know as his version of certainty. "And we're still here." She was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded, the firm nod of someone who has confirmed a decision she already made. "We're still here," she agreed. It was around this time that Red Hollow began, slowly and without any single announcement, to change its opinion. Not dramatically. Towns do not change their opinions dramatically. They shift them in increments, one conversation at a time, one observed fact at a time, until eventually the accumulated weight of evidence is enough to tip the balance. What was tipping it in Red Hollow was the steady accumulation of Caleb Boone being, simply and consistently, not what they had decided he was. He paid his debts on time and in full, which was not universally true of men with considerably more social standing. When a section of the road north of town washed out in a summer storm, he was among the first 3 men on the scene with tools and labor, and without requiring any asking. He was, to those who dealt with him directly, plainly intelligent, the kind of man whose opinion on practical matters turned out, over time, to be worth having. And he was Evelyn Cross's husband, which, now that people were paying attention, did not look, upon closer examination, like the humiliation it had been presented as. Evelyn noticed the shift. She was attuned to it in the way that someone who has been the subject of a town's judgment becomes attuned to changes in that judgment's temperature. The open sympathy from women like Martha Kelly had become something more ambiguous. Not quite respect, not yet, but the early-stage reconsideration that precedes it. The dismissiveness toward Caleb in the general store and the feed supply had become something more careful, more hesitant, as though people were re-examining the notes they'd made and finding them less reliable than they'd believed. Preston Mercer, she heard from the occasional piece of gossip that filtered north, had become engaged to a girl from a ranching family in the next county. She felt about this with a neutrality that surprised her until she thought about it and realized it didn't surprise her at all. Preston Mercer had happened to her. He had not become part of her. Clayton Mercer was a different matter. She thought about Clayton Mercer with a cold clarity that had not diminished over the months. She thought about his hands across the desk and the expression on his face at her wedding and the deliberate way he had arranged her life as though it were a business asset to be deployed. She did not allow herself to feel much about it because feeling much about it was not productive. But she tracked it, the way you track something you know you will eventually have to address. That eventually, she sensed, was getting closer. She was in town on a Thursday afternoon in late July, buying supplies at the general store, when she heard his voice. Clayton Mercer was at the far end of the counter, talking to the store owner about a land assessment, and he did not see her at first. She had a moment, therefore, to observe him before he observed her. He looked older than she remembered, though it had only been 9 months. There was something slightly reduced about him, something she could not immediately name. He was still commanding, still the magistrate, still the man with the papers on half the debts in town. But some quality of absolute certainty she remembered from October seemed, fractionally, barely perceptibly, diminished. When he finally registered her presence, his face did something complicated. Mrs. Boone, he said. The correction was deliberate, she thought, a small assertion. Mr. Mercer, she said. Even, unhurried. He looked at her with that assessment that had always made her feel like inventory, and for the first time she noticed that it failed to reach her. The look landed somewhere short of its target. She had become, over these months, something harder to penetrate. You look well, he said. I am well, she replied. Thank you. A pause. Several customers in the store were very carefully not listening. The Boone property, he said. I hear it's developing. It is. And Boone? He's managing it to your satisfaction? The question was gauged precisely to suggest she might not be satisfied, might be merely performing contentment. She looked at Clayton Mercer with the calmness of someone who has sorted through all the complicated feelings about a situation and arrived on the other side of them. My husband, she said, putting the word down with specific clarity, is one of the most capable people in this valley. I'm aware that's not what you expected when you arranged things as you did. I suspect, she continued, keeping her voice pleasant and her eyes level, that the arrangement was intended to diminish both of us. I want you to know that it has done the opposite. The store was very quiet. Mercer's expression did that complicated thing again, something that was not quite shame, because she doubted he'd arrived at shame, but might have been the early uncomfortable precursor to it. "I'm glad it's worked out," he said, with the flatness of a man who is not entirely glad. "I know you are," she said, meaning something different by it. She paid for her supplies and left. She sat on Augusta outside for a moment before riding, her hands on the reins, the July sun on her face. She thought about how that conversation would have felt in October, how it would have felt to be Evelyn Cross in October, standing across from the man who had done what he had done, without the 9 months of winter and spring and the person she had become in them to stand behind her. Different, she thought. It would have felt very different. She rode north out of town toward the mountains, toward the property that was hers as much as anyone's now, toward the man she had chosen with the same deliberate intelligence she brought to everything that mattered, and she felt, not triumphant exactly, because the situation was still what it had been, the injustice of it was still real, but settled. She felt settled in a way she had not felt since before October, and she thought it was a better kind of settled than she'd had before. The earlier version had been built on assumptions and the comfort of privilege and things that turned out to be less permanent than they'd appeared. This version was built on something that had been tested repeatedly by cold and hardship and the sustained proximity of a difficult reality. This version had been earned. The property came into view ahead. The barn, the cabin, the old structure that was going to become a school, the south pasture green and gold in the late afternoon. She could see him working near the fence line, a small figure in the distance, and the sight of him did the thing it had been doing for months, and that she had stopped pretending to herself that she didn't notice. She had not planned to fall in love in Red Hollow. She had not planned for any of this. But here she was. Here, she thought, guiding Augusta toward home, was exactly where she was. The messenger arrived on a Wednesday morning in the first week of August, when the summer heat was at its most relentless, and the valley lay under a sky so blue it looked almost aggressive. Evelyn was at the schoolhouse, the old equipment structure that Caleb had spent 3 weeks converting with the patient precision he brought to all physical work, adding the south-facing windows she'd specified, clearing and leveling the floor, building crude but functional benches from lumber he'd sourced from a mill 20 miles west. She had been spending her mornings there for the past 2 weeks, preparing materials, organizing what she'd managed to gather from town and from her own supplies, a small collection of primers, slates she'd ordered through the general store, paper she rationed carefully, and a primer she was writing herself in the evenings for children who were starting from nothing. She was testing the light through the new windows when she heard a horse on the road. The messenger was a young man from town she recognized as one of the clerks from the telegraph office, 17, maybe 18. With the slightly breathless quality of someone who had ridden fast because the errand felt urgent and because nobody had told him whether it was or not. "Mrs. Boone," he said, pulling up. "Message for you, from Red Hollow." He held out an envelope. She came out of the schoolhouse and took it. The handwriting on the outside was her father's housekeeper's, Margaret, who had been with the Cross family for 11 years and whose penmanship was distinctive. Large, slightly backward slanting letters that always looked like they were leaning into a wind. She opened it, standing in the yard, the messenger waiting on his horse. "Miss Evelyn, your father has taken ill. Dr. Prairie has been here twice. He is resting but asked for you. Please come when you are able. He says not urgent, but I think you should come soon. M." She read it twice. She noted the particular gap between "he says not urgent, and I think you should come soon," and understood that Margaret, who was not a dramatic woman, was telling her something in the space between those two sentences. "Thank you," she told the messenger. "Tell them I'll come tomorrow morning." She went to find Caleb. He was at the south fence, resetting the post she'd noticed heaving back in March, the same ones she'd mentioned the day after she'd read his letter, which she still had, folded carefully in the small box with her mother's things. He had been working for 2 hours and was dirty and sweating in the August heat, and when he saw her face, he stopped and straightened. "What's happened?" She gave him the note. He read it. Still the careful reading, still the slight deliberateness, but there was nothing labored in it now. He was fully literate and had been for months. He read it in the time it took her to watch him read it, and then looked up. "I'll come with you," he said. Not a question. She had been prepared, she realized, to argue with him about this, to tell him the property needed managing, that it wasn't necessary, that she could handle her father's household without him present. She realized she didn't want to make that argument. She was tired of making arguments she didn't actually believe in for the sake of a pride that was no longer serving her. "All right," she said. He nodded once and went back to the fence post. Not because he was dismissing the conversation, but because there were 2 hours of daylight left and the fence still needed finishing. She went back to the schoolhouse to close it up for the morning and felt, in the efficiency of that exchange, the specific comfort of being with someone who didn't require her to perform her emotions before they were ready. They left for Red Hollow at first light the following morning. The ride was 2 hours by wagon on the road that Evelyn had traveled 100 times in her life. First as a child in her father's buggy, then as a young woman on Augusta, and now, for the first time, with Caleb beside her on the wagon bench, the mountains behind them, the town drawing closer ahead. She thought about the last time she had made this journey, 9 months ago, in the opposite direction, with everything she owned in the wagon bed and the life she'd expected already gone. She thought about the person she'd been then, furious and controlled, and very, very alone in the specific way that people are alone when they've decided that needing other people is a vulnerability they can't afford. "You're quiet," Caleb said. "I'm thinking." "About your father?" "About the last time I made this road." She looked at the horizon. "About who I was then." He was quiet for a moment. "Who were you?" She considered. Someone who had decided that surviving was enough. That if I could just get through each situation with my dignity intact, that was a sufficient goal. A pause. "I hadn't thought about what I was surviving toward." He didn't respond to that immediately, in the way she'd come to recognize as him giving something the weight it deserved. "And now? Now I know what I'm going toward." She glanced at him. "That's different. It changes how the surviving feels." He looked at the road ahead. "Yes," he said simply. "It does." They arrived in Red Hollow at mid-morning. The town looked to Evelyn both completely familiar and slightly foreign in the way that places you have left look when you return to them. The same buildings, the same street layout, the same faces and the same windows, but with the slight overlay of distance that comes from having lived somewhere else and become, in the process, someone who is no longer entirely of this place. She noticed the looks. They were different from the looks she had received in March, when she'd come for supplies and felt the weight of pity and amusement and all the varied textures of a small town's opinion pressing on her from every angle. These looks had something more complicated in them. She was not certain, in that first pass through the main street, what it was. The Cross house was on the north end of town, and Margaret met them at the door with the compressed efficiency of a woman who had been managing a worry alone and was relieved to hand some portion of it to someone else. "He's upstairs," she said. "He had a bad night 2 nights ago. Dr. Pruitt left medicine. He's been taking it." She looked at Caleb with the careful neutrality of a woman who had served the Cross family long enough to know that her opinions were her own business. "Mr. Boone." "Ma'am," Caleb said. Margaret looked at Evelyn. "He asked for you by name yesterday evening, 3 times. I sent the message when I was sure the doctor wasn't going to say it was nothing." "You did right," Evelyn said. "Thank you." Edmund Cross was in his bed, which was where Evelyn had never seen him in her adult life. Her father was a man who was up before the house and to his desk before breakfast, and the image of him lying in the middle of the morning, propped against pillows, with the curtains drawn against the summer light, hit her with a force she wasn't entirely ready for. He was thinner than August should account for. There was a quality of compression to him, like something that had been under pressure for a long time and had finally begun to give. But his eyes, when she came through the door, were still her father's eyes, alert, taking her in with the specific attention of someone assessing what a person has become since they last looked carefully. "Evelyn," his voice was rough but present. "Papa." She came to the chair beside the bed and sat down. She took his hand. It was thinner than she remembered, the bones more distinct. He looked past her. "That's your husband." Caleb had stopped in the doorway, giving them space, doing the thing she had come to appreciate about him, reading a room and positioning himself correctly without being told. "Come in," Edmund said. Caleb came in and stood at a respectful distance, not so close that he was intruding, not so far that he was absent. "Mr. Cross," he said, "I'm sorry you're not well." Edmund looked at him with a frankness that was one of the few qualities that illness hadn't apparently diminished. "You look like a man who works." I do, Caleb said. My daughter. Is she... Edmund stopped. His jaw worked slightly. He looked at Evelyn. Are you treated well? She felt the complicated layers of that question, all the things inside it. The guilt, the hope for reassurance, the genuine need to know before whatever was happening to his health progressed further. She thought about what she could say that was both true and kind, and found, to her relief, that the true version was also the kind one. Better than I expected, she said. Better than I planned for. She held her father's hand more firmly. He's a good man, Papa. I know that's not what you thought you were arranging, but it's what happened. Edmund looked at Caleb again. Something in his expression shifted. It was not relief exactly. It was more like a man setting down something he had been carrying for a long time and not sure he was permitted to set down. I owe you an apology, Edmund said to Caleb. Caleb looked at him with that level steadiness. Sir, no, let me say it. Edmund's voice was thinner now, but the firmness was there. What was done to my daughter was wrong. What was done to you in the arrangement of it was also wrong. You were used as an instrument of someone else's power, and I allowed it because I was afraid, and I've thought about that every day since October. He paused to breathe. I don't expect you to absolve me of it. I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of what I did. The room was very quiet. Caleb looked at Evelyn Cross for a long moment, at this man who had failed his daughter and knew it, and was saying so from a sickbed without dressing it up in justification. Evelyn watched him and felt the particular tension of someone waiting for a verdict whose outcome matters. I appreciate that, Caleb said finally. Truly, he paused. She forgave you before you asked her to. I think you should know that too. Edmund looked at his daughter. His eyes were bright, and Evelyn recognized it with a catch in her chest because it was the particular brightness of a man who is not going to cry but is having to work at it. Have you? He asked. She had been holding it at arm's length for months. The anger, the sense of betrayal, the grief of a daughter who had trusted her father and found that trust had limits she hadn't known about. She had been practical about it because practicality was how she had survived, and sentiment had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Sitting here now, with his hand thin in hers, and the summer light coming in around the curtains and Caleb standing quietly in the corner, she found that practicality was not what was required. Yes, she said, I have. She meant it, not as performance, not as mercy offered from a distance, but as the real thing, complicated and incomplete and genuinely meant. I understand what fear does to people, Papa. I understand it better now than I did in October. Edmund closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were clearer. Tell me about the property, he said, in the tone of a man turning deliberately toward the future because he has done what he needed to do with the past. Tell me what you've built. She talked for an hour. She told him about the cattle and the creek pasture and the fence lines. She told him about the schoolhouse and the families in the valley and what she was planning. She told him about Tommy Hatch, about Daniel's letters, about the way the property looked in early morning light with the mountains behind it. Caleb added things when she left them out, practical details about the land and the herd, figures he had in his head with the accuracy of someone who managed everything himself without ever writing it down until she'd taught him to. Edmund listened with his eyes mostly open, asking occasional questions, and the questions were the questions of a banker, precise, forward-looking, interested in the structural soundness of things. She realized, somewhere in the middle of that hour, that she was not just reassuring him. She was reporting to him as a peer. She was telling him what she had built the way one competent person tells another, and he was receiving it that way. It was, in its small way, one of the things she had always wanted from him and had not, until this hour, fully received. When his energy began to flag, visible in the slight graying of his face, the slower responses, she told him to sleep and stood up. He caught her hand. I'm going to get better, he said. It was not quite a statement of fact. It was something between a plan and a request. I know, she said, though she thought there was getting better and there was getting better, and she was not certain which he was capable of. I have things I want to fix, he said. Before he stopped. I have things I want to fix. She squeezed his hand. Rest first. Then we'll talk about fixing things. She left him sleeping and went downstairs, where Caleb was in the kitchen with Margaret, who had apparently determined from a few minutes of quiet conversation that he was not going to eat her out of house and home and was therefore acceptable company. He had a cup of coffee, and she had been telling him something about the house's plumbing that required attention, gesturing at a pipe under the kitchen window with the concentrated dissatisfaction of someone who had been managing a problem alone for too long. Evelyn leaned in the kitchen doorway and watched them for a moment. This man she had married against her will, sitting in her father's kitchen, listening to her father's housekeeper describe a plumbing problem with the full attention of someone for whom a plumbing problem is actually interesting. She thought about how wrong her assumptions had been 9 months ago. She thought about how wrong the town's assumptions still were, and how slowly that was changing, and how much work remained. She came into the kitchen. "How bad is the pipe?" "Manageable," Caleb said. "I can look at it before we leave." Margaret looked at Evelyn with an expression that she could not fully interpret. Not quite approval, because Margaret's approval was not a thing given in expressions. It was a thing given in the repeated decision to remain in your service. But something in that direction. Something in the neighborhood. "I'll make dinner," Margaret said, and turned to the stove with the conclusiveness of a woman who has made her decision about a situation. They stayed 2 nights. The first evening, after Edmund had slept and woken and eaten a small amount and slept again, Evelyn and Caleb sat on the back porch of the Cross house in the August dark and talked about what came next. About her father's health, about who would manage the Cross house affairs if Edmund's condition didn't improve, about what the doctor had actually said beneath the professional reassurances. It was a hard conversation. Not because they couldn't have it, but because the reality they were mapping out was not a comfortable one. Evelyn Cross was not dying, not imminently, not necessarily, but he was not the man he had been, and the banker's house and the remnants of the banker's position required someone with the capability to manage them. "I could come down more often," Evelyn said. "Once the school is running, the mornings would be the students, but afternoons, it's a 2-hour ride," Caleb said. "You can't do that daily." "I know." She looked at her hands. "But I can't leave him with no one but Margaret. What if Margaret had help? Someone from town, a capable woman who could manage the household accounts and the correspondence." He paused. "And what if you came once a week, stayed 2 nights, managed the larger decisions?" She turned this over. It was not a perfect solution. She could see its limitations clearly. He would resist being managed. "He might surprise you," Caleb said. "He's already surprised me today." She looked at him. "He impressed you." "The apology impressed me," Caleb said carefully. "It takes something to say that to a man you put in a bad situation. He didn't have to. He did it anyway, and he did it clean, no excuses attached." Evelyn thought about her father lying in that bed, looking at Caleb with the assessment of a banker who has realized his calculation was wrong and is not going to pretend otherwise. "He's always been better at honesty than comfort. It's where I get it from." "I noticed," Caleb said. She almost smiled. "Don't say it like that." "Like what?" "Like it explains a lot." "It explains quite a lot," he said, and there was enough warmth under the dry delivery that she let it go and looked at the August sky instead. The second day brought Clayton Mercer. She had not expected him. She had in some part of her mind known he might come. Red Hollow was not large, and Evelyn Cross's illness was not a secret, and Mercer was the kind of man who paid condolence calls because they served a function. But she had not specifically prepared for him. He came in the early afternoon, formally dressed despite the heat, with the careful presentation of someone who has thought about the visit in advance. Margaret showed him to the sitting room and came to find Evelyn with the particular expression of a woman relaying information she considers a problem. "Mercer's here," she said quietly. "Downstairs. He asked for your father." "My father is resting," Evelyn said. "I'll see him." She came downstairs alone. She had considered for a moment asking Caleb to come and had decided against it. Not because she needed distance from him, but because she needed this particular conversation to happen on her own terms, and her own terms did not include needing a man present to be taken seriously. Mercer was standing when she entered the sitting room, which was a deliberate social courtesy and told her nothing about what was underneath it. He was 61, she knew. She had always known his age the way you know things about powerful men in your hometown, because that information is ambient. He looked, in this sitting room that she had grown up in, slightly larger than he should have. He had always had that quality. He had spent 40 years in this town as the man whose opinion bent things in his direction, and it sat on him like a physical property. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "I heard about your father. I wanted to pay my respects." "He's resting," she said. "I'll pass on your regards." Mercer looked at her with the assessing quality she remembered. "You look well. The frontier life seems to suit you." "The life suits me," she agreed. "I don't assign it to the geography." He was quiet for a moment. There was something he wanted to say. She could see it in the way he was standing, a kind of preparation in the posture, a gathering, the look of a man who has rehearsed something and is deciding whether to deliver it. "I want to say something," he said, "and I'll say it plainly because I think you prefer plain." "Always." He looked at her. The expression on his face was, she realized with a slight shock, genuinely uncomfortable. Not the discomfort of a man caught in something, but the discomfort of a man who has been sitting with something for a long time and has decided it's become too heavy to carry without at least setting it down in front of the person it concerns. "What I arranged last year," he said. "The situation with your father's debt. The way it was resolved." He stopped, started again. "I arranged it for reasons that had more to do with my son's wounded pride than anything else. You know that. I knew it then." Another pause. "I didn't expect—" He seemed to look for the word and find it unsatisfying. "I didn't think about you as a person with your own life in front of you. I thought about you as a problem to be arranged around." Evelyn waited. "I'm not asking you to forgive that," he said. "I'm saying I know what it was. And the man you married, Boone, he has turned out to be more than I understood him to be, which means I placed him wrong too." His jaw moved slightly. "I'm not good at this kind of conversation. I don't have practice with it." "I can see that," she said. She looked at Clayton Mercer in her father's sitting room and thought about what she wanted to say to him, about what she had carried since October, about the handshake across his desk, about watching her own wedding from inside the controlled stillness she'd built to survive it. She had more to say to this man than she had words currently organized for. She also thought about what she had said to her father that morning, about what fear did to people, about understanding it better than she had in October. She did not think Clayton Mercer was a good man. She thought he was a powerful man who had behaved badly because power had never required him to do otherwise, and because his son's humiliation had given him personal motivation to use that power without the usual restraint. She thought he was, possibly, sitting in this room with something that was the beginning of a reckoning with that. Something that had perhaps started in July when she'd looked at him across the counter of the general store and told him plainly what he had done and what had come of it. She thought he was a man who might, with the right sustained pressure from the consequences of his own choices, become slightly less of what he had been. That was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was not what she had available for Clayton Mercer. Not yet, possibly not for a long time. But it was something. It was the recognition of a human being in the process of incomplete reckoning, and she was capable of acknowledging that without surrendering her own position. "I understand what you've said," she told him. "I won't pretend it resolves anything. What you did had consequences that were real and are still real." She kept her voice level. "But I hear what you're saying, and I'll pass on your regards to my father." He nodded. One slow nod of a man accepting the exact terms he'd been offered and finding them, despite their limitation, fair. He left. She stood in the sitting room for a moment after the door closed, in the quiet of her father's house, and felt the particular feeling of having handled something without the anger she had always assumed would be required. She had been so certain, in October, that the only appropriate response to what had been done to her was rage, sustained, righteous, the kind of fury that had kept her upright through the winter months like a rod of iron down her spine. What she found, standing here now, was that the iron rod was still there. She had not given it up. She had not forgiven too easily or folded when she shouldn't have. But there was room alongside the iron for something else. The complicated, imperfect human process of dealing with things as they actually were, rather than as she wished they had been. She heard the kitchen door and footsteps, and then Caleb's voice, talking to Margaret about the pipe. It sounded like he'd found an additional problem, something about the fitting, and was explaining to Margaret with the patience of someone who is not frustrated by discovered complications because complications are just more of the same work. She stood there and listened to his voice for a moment. Then she went to find him. He was under the kitchen window, on his back on the kitchen floor with his shirt dirty and his attention on a pipe joint that had, apparently, revealed itself to be in worse condition than initially suspected. He looked up when she came in. "It's the fitting," he said. "The whole joint needs replacing. I can do it, but I'll need to go to the hardware." "The hardware is 2 streets over," she said. "I'll come with you." He looked at her face. Mercer came. He came. And? She leaned against the kitchen door frame. "And nothing dramatic?" He said his piece. "I said mine." She paused. "He's not going to be anything other than what he is. But I think he's going to be slightly less of it, going forward." Caleb considered this. That might be the best available outcome. "I think so too." She looked at the pipe. "How long will the repair take?" "If I have the right fitting, an hour." He sat up. "Your father's house will have working plumbing before we leave." She looked at him. On the floor of her father's kitchen, dirty from the repair, matter-of-fact about the work the way he was matter-of-fact about all work. The man this town had dismissed, and her father's debt had delivered to her like a consequence rather than a gift. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for coming with me." He held her eyes for a moment. "I told you in January," he said, "that I didn't ask for any of this." "That's still true." He paused. "But I'm glad I'm here, in case that wasn't clear." "It's clear," she said. She reached down and took his hand and pulled him up from the kitchen floor, and they went to the hardware together in the August afternoon, walking through the streets of Red Hollow side by side. And she noticed, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of something settling into its proper place, that the people they passed looked at them differently than they had in March. Not yet with understanding, not yet with the full recognition of what they had built in the valley and what they intended to build still, but differently, with a reconsideration happening behind their eyes. That was enough, she thought, for now. The town would catch up. She had time. They returned to the property on a Friday afternoon with the summer still burning hard over the valley and Evelyn Cross sitting up in his bed eating Margaret's soup and arguing, gently but persistently, about whether he was well enough to review the bank's quarterly accounts. He was not. But the arguing itself was a good sign. Evelyn had left him with 2 things: a household arrangement that included a capable woman from town named Clara Briggs, who had been widowed the previous winter and needed the work, and had the particular organized intelligence of someone who had been managing complicated situations alone for long enough to be good at it. And a promise, not the loose social kind, but the specific contractual kind that Evelyn Cross understood and respected, that she would come every 10 days, stay 2 nights, and review whatever required reviewing. He had accepted this with the careful dignity of a man learning, at 61, to receive help from his daughter as though it were help between equals rather than charity flowing downward. That shift, small as it appeared from the outside, was not small to Evelyn. The ride back north had been quieter than the ride down. Not the quiet of things unresolved, but the quiet of 2 people who have been through something together and are processing it in the same direction. The mountains came back into their proper proportion as they drove, filling the northern horizon with the permanence that had become, over the past year, something that felt less like indifference and more like reliability. "Clara Briggs," Caleb said at some point in the second hour. "She seemed capable." "She's more than capable. She managed her husband's estate through 2 years of creditor disputes without a lawyer." Evelyn watched the road. "She reminded me of myself a little. The version of me from before October. Sharper edges? More to prove." She thought about it. "Though I think she's earned the sharpness. Her situation was harder than mine." He glanced at her. "Yours wasn't soft." "I know, but I had you." She said it without making anything of it. A simple statement of fact, the kind she had learned to make without qualification, because qualification was a habit of people who weren't yet sure what they had, and she was entirely sure. "She has nobody. That's a different kind of hard." He nodded, looking back at the road. "I'm going to bring her out to see the school," Evelyn said. "In September, once we're running." She paused. "She has 2 children, a boy and a girl. The girl is 8. He almost smiled. "You're already recruiting." "I'm always already recruiting," she said. "You should know that by now." The school opened on the 2nd Monday of September. Evelyn had spent the 3 weeks between August and opening day in a sustained practical effort that left her tired in a way that was entirely different from the bone-deep exhaustion of the first winter. That exhaustion had been the tiredness of survival, of a body and mind working against difficulty. This was the tiredness of building, the specific depletion of someone expending energy towards something rather than simply against something. It felt, she thought, considerably better. She had 7 students on that first Monday, 4 from Valley families that Caleb had personally ridden out to speak with, 2 separate households in the long, flat country to the east, another 3 miles to the northwest, near the base of the foothills where a family named Prairie had 3 children between the ages of 7 and 12. Tommy Hatch came, though at 19 he was substantially older than the others, and sat in the back of the room with the self-consciousness of a young man who was aware of the situation's awkwardness and had decided to be there anyway. Clara Briggs' daughter, Ruth, came the first week when Clara brought her out to see the school as Evelyn had invited, and stayed, Clara arranging, within 48 hours, a weekly schedule that allowed the girl to make the ride with a neighbor who passed the property on his way to the feed store. The schoolhouse smelled of fresh lumber and chalk dust and the particular quality of early autumn air coming through the south-facing windows that Caleb had built with dimensions she had specified down to the inch. The benches were rough but functional. The slates were not enough. She had 7 students and 5 slates, which meant the 2 youngest shared, which required a degree of negotiation that Evelyn managed with a patience she had not previously been sure she possessed. It was not organized. The first week was genuinely difficult in ways she had not fully anticipated from her 3 years of assisting the Red Hollow schoolteacher, because assisting was not leading, and a room of children who did not know each other and did not yet know her was a different proposition from a classroom she'd stepped into already structured by someone else's authority. The youngest child, a girl named Bess Pruitt, 7 years old, with a permanent look of fierce evaluation on her face, spent the first morning sitting with her arms crossed and her chin down in the posture of someone who had been told this was good for her and had suspended judgment. By Thursday, Bess Pruitt was the first one in the door each morning. Children, Evelyn was learning, were not so different from adults in the fundamental thing. They responded to being taken seriously, to having someone look at them without the complicated overlay of whatever assumptions the world had already formed and simply ask, "What do you know? And what do you want to know?" She had learned that lesson, she thought, from the other side of a table in a winter cabin with a man who had been waiting 28 years for someone to look at him that way. Caleb, meanwhile, was doing something that had no official name but was becoming, by September, a regular feature of the property's rhythms. 3 evenings a week, after the school day, and after the ranch work that consumed his days, he sat with laborers. Not just Tommy Hatch, who was by now reading with genuine fluency and working his way through a collection of agricultural pamphlets, with the focused enthusiasm of someone discovering that knowledge he always needed had always been available. But others, men from the valley and the outlying ranches who had heard, through the particular information network of frontier communities that operates mostly through implication and secondhand mention, that there was a man north of Red Hollow who would sit with you without condescension and teach you letters and numbers and not charge you for it and not make you feel like less than yourself for needing it. They came cautiously, the way adults come to anything that requires them to acknowledge a lack. A man of 43 who had managed a ranch for 20 years and kept his accounts by memory and a system of marks his children couldn't read. 2 brothers who had come west from a situation that had not allowed for schooling. A woman, the first woman, whose arrival caused a small recalibration of the evening's social geography that Caleb navigated with a matter-of-factness that Evelyn respected enormously, who was 31 and wanted to read her late mother's letters. Evelyn watched all of this happening on her property and thought about what it meant. She had come here in October to survive. That had been the whole of the plan: get through, maintain dignity, keep her father from ruin, manage whatever came after with intelligence and practicality and the stripped-down competence of a person who has nothing left to lose but her own character. What had actually happened was something she could not have designed if she had tried. The frontier had intended to diminish her. The arrangement had been constructed as a punishment for her refusal, for her father's weakness, for the particular offense of being a woman who would not be managed by a man who thought management was his right. What it had produced instead was the most serious and structurally sound version of herself she had yet occupied. What it had given her, Unintentionally and entirely against the intentions of the people who had arranged it was Caleb. And Caleb, turned out, was not a consolation prize. He was the thing itself. In October, the school's second month, a delegation arrived. There was no other word for it. 4 people from Red Hollow on a Wednesday afternoon. Martha Kelly, who had been her mother's acquaintance, a man named Hector Vance, who ran the dry goods store and served on the town council, a younger woman named June Prairie, who taught in the Red Hollow School, and to Evelyn's considerable surprise, Daniel Boone. Caleb's brother had written in September that he intended to visit. The letter, Caleb had shown it to her, naturally, because that was how they operated, said he would be in the territory for 3 weeks on legal business and would ride out if the invitation was open. Caleb had written back in 2 days, which for him was nearly instantaneous. Daniel Boone was 34, 2 years older than Caleb, with the same dark hair but a leaner build and the specific quality of a man who had spent years working with language and argument, a sharpness around the eyes, a quickness of speech that Caleb didn't have. He arrived on horseback, looked at the property, looked at his brother and said, "You built this." "We built it," Caleb said. Daniel looked at Evelyn. "Mrs. Boone." "Mr. Boone." She took his hand. "I've heard about you, and I have heard about you," he said, with a warmth that was not performed. "More specifically, I have been reading about you for months in letters from a man who before last year had not written to me in 3 years. She glanced at Caleb. He looked at the mountains. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." The Red Hollow delegation had come. It emerged over the course of that long Wednesday afternoon with something between a proposal and a request. June Prairie, the town schoolteacher, had heard, again through that invisible frontier information network, about the Valley School. She had ridden out the previous month on her own, unofficially, and had spent an afternoon watching Evelyn teach and had gone back to Red Hollow with opinions. Those opinions had apparently been shared with Martha Kelly, who had shared them with Hector Vance, who was on the town council and therefore had the theoretical authority to make a certain kind of conversation official. "The town council," Vance said, sitting at Evelyn's table with his hat in his hands and the careful manner of a man making a proposal he's not certain will be accepted, has been discussing whether there might be a formal arrangement between your school here and the Red Hollow School. Students who are too far out to attend in town, who might otherwise fall through. A kind of extended program. Evelyn looked at him. "What kind of arrangement exactly?" "Resources partly. We have primer supplies that aren't being used fully. The enrollment in town has been down. June thought," he nodded toward the school teacher, "she thought some of those materials might be better used out here." "And in return?" Evelyn asked, because there was always a return and she had learned not to wait for it to be mentioned as an afterthought. Vance and June Prairie exchanged a brief look. "Recognition, mainly," June said, taking over with the directness of someone more comfortable with honesty than diplomatic positioning. "If the council acknowledges the Valley School formally, it means the families out here have a legitimate educational structure. It helps them. It helps their children." She paused. "It also means that what you're doing can continue without requiring explanation every time someone in town has a question about it." Evelyn understood this. The explanation June Prairie was delicately not naming was the one that would otherwise be required whenever a woman running an unofficial frontier school came to the attention of people with official opinions about the proper order of things. She looked at Caleb. He was watching her with the expression she knew as his version of support, present, attentive, entirely non-directive. He had learned over the year not to make decisions for her in the way that men make decisions for women by simply occupying the space where the decision should be made. And she had learned to look at him not for permission, but for the particular grounding quality of his steadiness when she was about to do something that required her to be entirely sure of herself. She looked back at Vance. "I have conditions." He nodded. He had, she thought, expected this. Her conditions were not theatrical. They were practical. The materials to be delivered, not collected. She would not be sending students to Red Hollow to prove they deserve supplies. The arrangement to be documented formally in the council record so that it couldn't be quietly dissolved when someone with a different opinion about women running schools took a seat on the council. And the Valley School to retain its own curriculum decisions, She was not going to teach to Red Hollow's preferences if Red Hollow's preferences conflicted with what her students actually needed. Vance worked through her conditions with the focused attention of a man taking something seriously. He agreed to 2 immediately, negotiated mildly on the 3rd. She kept the curriculum independence. He asked for a quarterly report to the council. She accepted that because a quarterly report was not a transfer of authority, but an exchange of information. And by the end of the afternoon, they had an agreement. Martha Kelly, who had been quiet through most of the negotiation, said as they were preparing to leave, "Your mother would have been proud of you, Evelyn." Evelyn looked at her. Martha had known her mother longer than almost anyone in Red Hollow. She said it with the simplicity of a genuine statement rather than a social one. "I think she would have liked this place," Evelyn said. "She never minded hard things." "No," Martha agreed. "She didn't." There was a moment between them, 2 women in a frontier kitchen, across the distance of a year that had changed one of them significantly. And then it passed, and Martha put on her hat and went out to her horse, and the delegation rode south toward Red Hollow, and the property returned to its own rhythms in the October afternoon. Daniel stayed 3 days. He and Caleb spent long hours together. Some of it Evelyn witnessed, some of it she gave them privacy for, because there were 3 years of silence between those 2 brothers, and some of the filling of it was not her conversation to be part of. What she saw of it was good. Daniel was sharp and quick and fond of his brother, in the slightly complicated way of an older sibling who has also been absent, fond but aware of the absence, working around a guilt he didn't put into words because Caleb wouldn't have wanted him to. She heard them one evening on the front step, late, after she had gone inside. She was not listening deliberately. The window was open to the cooling October air, and their voices carried. Daniel was saying, "You're different." "From what?" "From the last time I saw you, you're—" A pause. "You look like a person who lives somewhere, not someone just getting through." A silence. Then Caleb, "I do live somewhere." "It's more than the land," Daniel said. "You know that." Another pause. Longer. "I know that," Caleb said. She turned over in the dark and looked at the ceiling and felt something that was too ordinary for a dramatic word and too real for a polite one. She felt happy. Not in the large, performed way of celebrations, but in the small, consistent way of a person who has made a life they recognize as their own. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. Daniel left on a Friday. He shook Evelyn's hand at the door and then, in a departure from the formality of that, briefly embraced her. The embrace of a man who doesn't do it often and means it when he does. "Take care of him," he said quietly. "We take care of each other," she said, equally quietly. He looked at her, nodded with the nod of someone receiving a correction that improves on what they said. "Yes," he said, "I can see that." The anniversary arrived in late October, on a Thursday, 1 year from the wedding that neither of them had wanted, and both of them were, in their different ways, no longer able to imagine having been without. It was an ordinary day in most of its particulars. She had school in the morning, 8 students now, Bess Pruitt having brought her older brother in September without consulting anyone, which Evelyn had handled by simply adding a bench. Caleb had fence work and 2 of the evening learners coming after supper. The October air was back to the cold she remembered from their first weeks together, the mountain light low and golden, the first suggestion of the winter that was coming beginning to settle into the edges of the days. She did not expect him to remember the specific date. She was not certain she had expected to feel anything particular about it herself. Anniversaries of painful things were complicated. She had learned this about herself over the year. The painful thing and what the painful thing had led to were not the same thing, and marking them with the same date required a particular kind of double vision she was still developing. She came in from the school at noon to find something on the table. It was a journal. Handmade, not purchased, not assembled from commercial components. He had built it, bound pages between 2 pieces of cured leather, stitched at the spine with the careful and slightly uneven stitching of a man who had taught himself the technique from a book and practiced it until it worked. The leather was good. She recognized it as from a piece he'd kept aside in the barn, a quality piece, the kind you saved for something specific. She stood at the table and looked at it for a moment without picking it up. Then she opened it. The first page was in his handwriting. The writing she had watched develop from uncertain block letters traced on scrap paper in the firelight of their first winter to this. Still deliberate, still distinctly his in its precision, but fluent now. Fully his. He had written, on the first page, "You taught me to read so that I could learn things from the world. What I didn't know then was that the first thing I was going to learn was you." She stood at the table with the journal open and felt the thing she had felt in February when she'd read his first letter. That same interior reorganization, that same quality of something unnamed completing its shape. Only this time she knew what the shape was. She had been living inside it for months. The rest of the pages were blank. That was intentional. She understood immediately. He came in 20 minutes later from the yard, and she was still at the table, and he stopped when he saw her face. "Too much?" he asked. She shook her head. "No. I wasn't sure. Caleb." She looked at him. "It's exactly right." He came to the table and sat down across from her, the way he had sat across from her for an entire winter while she taught him letters by lamplight. She thought about all the evenings at this table, all the conversations that had built something neither of them had planned and both of them now couldn't have done without. "1 year," he said. "1 year," she agreed. He looked at the journal. "I thought you could write the next part, of whatever this is." "I think we both write it," she said. "I'll probably spell things wrong. I'll correct them." He almost smiled. That expression she had learned to read in all its variations, that understated warmth that was entirely his and entirely real. "That's not going to stop." "I know," she said. "I don't want it to." They sat in the October quiet. Outside, the mountains held their position against the sky, patient and indifferent and entirely reliable. The creek ran in the distance. Somewhere in the south pasture, the cattle were moving in the afternoon light. This was not a perfect life. Evelyn had enough honesty to hold that clearly. The winters would remain hard. The frontier would remain unforgiving of mistakes, slow to reward effort, quicker to punish failure than to acknowledge survival. Her father's health was a concern that would not resolve neatly. Clayton Mercer was still the magistrate of Red Hollow, and still the man whose hand was on most of the levers of power in the county, whatever small shift had occurred in his sitting room in August. The school would face resistance from people who thought frontier children didn't need letters, and that women who thought otherwise were putting ideas where ideas didn't belong. None of that had gone away. What had changed was what she stood on. The ground under her feet was different from the ground she had stood on in October of the previous year. Not geographically, not structurally, but in the specific way that ground changes when you have stopped moving across it and have chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of its imperfections, to stay. She thought about the women she had known growing up who had made choices out of fear and called them choices. Her father, who had borrowed in secrecy from men like Mercer and called it management. The town of Red Hollow, which had looked at a laborer and called him lesser, and looked at a disgraced banker's daughter and called her fallen, and been wrong about both in ways that were still slowly becoming visible. She thought about what it cost to reduce a person to a function. She had been reduced to a debt, to a mechanism for settling accounts. Caleb had been reduced to his labor, to his lack of formal education, to the word servant that people used when they meant to diminish. What got lost in that reduction, on both sides, was the actual person, the intelligence, the stubbornness, the capacity for love that had nothing to do with social standing or the balance of a ledger. Red Hollow was learning this, slowly, imperfectly, with the occasional relapse that came whenever someone's assumptions were more comfortable than the evidence. But learning it, because of this property, because of the schoolhouse with its south-facing windows, because of the evenings 3 times a week, where men who had been told their whole lives that literacy was not for them, sat down and discovered it was. Because of Caleb, who had spent 28 years carrying an absence and had filled it, and was now, methodically and without announcement, helping others do the same. Because of Evelyn, who had arrived here with nothing she had chosen and had built, out of difficulty and unexpected partnership, and the particular tenacity of a woman who did not know how to stop noticing things, something that mattered. She picked up the journal. She turned past the first page to the blank ones. She looked at him across the table. "Do you want to know what I'm going to write first?" she asked. "Tell me." That the thing I was most wrong about, in October, was thinking that being given no choice was the same as having nothing. She set her hand flat on the blank page. "I had everything, I just didn't know what it was yet. Caleb looked at her with the full weight of his attention, the way she had first noticed he looked at things back in October, with the particular quality of someone who had learned that the world didn't always offer second glances, so you looked carefully the first time. "Write it down," he said. She picked up the pen. She wrote, "Outside, the October light moved across the valley in the slow way of a season, making its last good effort, and the mountains stood where they had always stood. And somewhere in Red Hollow, a town was in the early stages of understanding that it had been wrong about two people who had never required its understanding in order to build something true. They had built it anyway. That was the whole of the story, and it was enough.